Boldwood presents Rogue Hero, written by Rob Sinclair, and read by Robert G. Slade. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Washington, D.C. Kedja Sterling rushed forward to open the doors for her boss. She knew he needed air. His face was flushed, his cheeks puffy. He messed with the collar of his shirt as he walked across the lobby. He didn't acknowledge her assistance as he strode out of the Plaza Hotel into the brisk spring morning. He paused and squeezed a finger between his neck and his shirt collar as if trying to release pressure, then grumbled something before he marched down the stone steps toward the waiting black Mercedes. "Senator Charlton!" came a shout from the right. Charlton groaned, and they glanced over to see a young female reporter scuttling across the steps toward them, phone in her hand held out in the hopes of getting a soundbite. What Charlton wanted to do, Kedja knew, was to ignore the reporter, carry on down the steps, get into the car, and away from there as fast as possible. Probably grab a scotch or four. "Senator Charlton, I wanted to ask you a question about the trade bill." What he did instead, just as she'd been vehemently training him to do, was push every ounce of discomfort to the back of his mind and reach for his winning smile before turning to face the journalist. "Elliot, make it quick," Kedja whispered to him, "just enough to show you care." The question wasn't really one of time. The point wasn't even that they'd just come out of a grueling 3-hour meeting with a band of idiots from the State Department, plus a bunch of overpaid technical consultants who didn't understand the first thing about senatorial duties. The point was, through his own desire, Charlton was increasingly a national figurehead for this administration. And if he wanted to rise any further, hell, if he just wanted to stay where he was on the slippery pole of politics a few years, he had to make sure that the public continued to see the carefully crafted image they'd worked so hard to cement. And Kedja knew that meant limiting how much off-script time he gave to journalists, anyone, to a bare minimum. The reporter, cheeks flushed and out of breath, came to a stop in front of them. "Sorry, Senator, I know you're busy, but I'd really like to ask a question about the trade bill." "That's okay," Charlton said, his face and manner as welcoming as ever. Some people called it sickening, but mostly he was considered charming, at least by the nation's right-wing press, who were already touting him as a future presidential candidate. With Kedja's help and some misfortune for others, she really believed she could get him there. "I really don't have much time, but fire away." "I realize the bill was fronted by your predecessor, Senator Nazari, but my understanding is that for the vast majority of companies, the changes you've instigated will substantially increase red tape for imports and will ultimately benefit companies outside the U.S. much more than our own." "What we're doing is positioning ourselves to take advantage of growing markets. But won't these changes hamper trade with some of your closest partners if you—" "Sorry, miss," Kedja said, stepping forward, placing herself in between her boss and the reporter. "Leanne Jarvis." "Mr. Charlton really does have to go now. We have a horribly busy schedule." "I promise you, Miss Jarvis, this bill will smooth external trade," Charlton went on, "not hamper it. But it will see a shift in terms of who we deal with. Thank you, but like my assistant said, I really do need to get going." Kedja smiled, satisfied with his final words, and she and Charlton turned away from Jarvis to bound down the remaining steps. "But Senator Charlton—" "Ignore her," Kedja said, and she reached forward and pulled open the back door of the Mercedes. Charlton reached the door, but Jarvis shouted out again. "I'd really like to arrange a full interview with you so you can properly explain—" she said. Charlton turned and pulled out his smile again. Of course, he said, before getting into the car. Kidget grabbed a business card from the reporter, then ushered her away, and soon both she and Charlton were safely inside the car. Just go, Kedja said to Marta, the impeccably dressed driver up front. Marta pulled the car into the road. Kedja caught the reporter's eye as they went past. She couldn't read the look she gave. Scathing, knowing. Kedja handed Charlton the business card. Evening Herald, he said, sounding disgusted. You just need to remember to keep your public face on, Kedja said. I know you did okay with that reporter, but in the meeting, you can't let the bastards get you down, as the saying goes. You never know who's watching, who's recording these days. You have to be— I get it, Charlton interrupted. Was his anger directed at her? She didn't know. Maybe at his own performance earlier, as his mask had slipped more than once. Would that come back to bite them? I'm not seeing much on social media yet, Kedja said, scrolling on her phone. But it'll probably take a few hours for things to properly filter through once people have given their version of events. What I can see so far is mostly positive. I think you'll be fine. Charlton said nothing. Kedja knew that at 28 years old, her more up-to-date view of the world was one of the very reasons why Charlton, in his 50s, relied so heavily on her to keep him on track with the younger generations. He, on the other hand, bullishly made as much as he could of pen and paper and what others viewed as outdated communication methods, because why not? Previous generations had got by doing so just fine, and he wouldn't change if he could avoid it. That was fine by Kedja. It earned Charlton a lot of support from like-minded individuals, but she was there to make sure he appealed to the masses, too. Of course, Kedja was much more than just an eye into the modern world. She was a political intellectual, too. Someone Charlton, who'd only turned to politics in the 6th decade of his life, still had a lot to learn from. Charlton knew how to handle the Chinese and Russians and Arabs in a boardroom, knew how to garner support from big businesses with promises of untold riches and lax regulation that had executives and shareholders drooling, but handling groups of left-wing zealots hankering for his blood was something different altogether. A challenge, although absolutely not an insurmountable one. Just look at how far they'd come already in his short career in politics. Where are you going? Kedja asked when Marta took a left turn rather than the expected right. To the capital? Then why are we heading further away? There was an accident, she said. This way will be quicker. Charlton didn't say anything but folded his arms and sat back in his seat as he stared out of the window. Within a couple of minutes, they were gridlocked. Kedja caught Marta's eye in the mirror. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know. Neither Charlton nor Kedja responded, but Charlton looked out of his window, doing a lousy job of hiding his contempt. It took longer than it should have, but they eventually made the turn onto Independence Avenue, where traffic trudged slowly back and forth along the wide street. The Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial were among the many renowned sights behind them, and the Capitol building loomed in the near distance in front. They closed in on the Capitol, tourists dotted here and there outside, mostly taking selfies in front of the statues of famous Americans past and present. They reached the intersection with Washington Avenue and came to a stop once more. Their destination was so close. Kedja knew Charlton was getting increasingly antsy now, with yet another big meeting on the horizon. Although he seemed unusually distracted, too. Something on his mind, other than the daily rigors of being a senator, she thought. Rather than try to reassure him, she looked away, out of her window, acting calm and collected, hoping it would rub off on him. She spotted two men on the sidewalk a few yards away, not tourists. They moved with more purpose. They weren't walking too quickly nor too slowly, yet somehow they didn't belong, as though the aura around them marked them out as imposters. Not unusual to see such types in a big city. Every other street had someone who didn't belong for one reason or another. Kedja kept an eye on them as they neared. Both men had their hands in the pockets of their thick jackets. The one on the left was jittery, and even though Kedja could see little of their faces under their hoods, he was definitely the youngest. The men were only 5 steps from the Mercedes when the younger man nudged the other as if he'd seen something that had grabbed his attention. With the nudge, the taller man lifted his head slightly too, his face fully visible now. Kedja's gaze followed his across the road, where she spotted 2 other men who could have been the mirror images of those closest to her. All 4 moved in unison toward the Mercedes as they pulled their hands from their jacket pockets. Guns. Kedja's heart jackhammered in her chest, while every other inch of her froze. A moment later, booming gunfire consumed every sense, stirring her to life. "Go, go, go!" she screamed to the driver. Marta didn't hesitate. She hit the accelerator and the Mercedes shot forward, gunfire bursting everywhere. Flashes of light cut through the foreground like strobes. Kedja, wide-eyed, was pushed back in her seat, glass shattered, then smash. Kedja was thrown forward, her face smacking into the seat back in front of her. Her nose burst open and blood poured out as pain erupted. They'd hit something and they were going nowhere. "Elliot!" she shouted. She spat blood and looked at Charlton. He was fumbling with his seatbelt. From somewhere she found an inner strength and focus, or perhaps it was just survival instinct. She unclasped her belt and slid across to Charlton as bullets raked the metalwork of the car on her side. She managed to release his belt and heaved open the crumpled door leading away from the gunfire. She quickly checked on Marta. Blood and grisly flesh covered the dashboard. Kedja gasped in horror before pushing Charlton out of the car and to the ground. She slipped out beside him, staying as low as she could. Pedestrians were running and screaming as the gunfire continued. "What's happening?" Charlton shouted. Kedja didn't bother to answer. She scanned the area. There'd been 2 men this side of the car moments before. Now, one lay on the ground, blood seeping from a hole in his chest. The other was in a frenzied attack with... who? Not a police officer. She couldn't see anyone in uniform. Kedja jolted as the rapid-fire gun released a hail of bullets, and their attacker scuttled away from the man he'd been tussling with, before dropping to the floor with a line of bullet holes rising up his torso. Kedja stared toward the other man with the gun as distant sirens cut through a momentary ceasefire. She heard the shouts of police officers already closing in. The man who'd felled the 2 shooters turned to her, made eye contact, pointed the gun toward them. "Get down!" Kedja pushed herself and Charlton to the ground as gunfire burst once more. Not at them anymore, though. This time it was directed somewhere else. "Go! Go!" she screamed at Charlton, pulling on his collar. "We need to go!" She got to her feet but stayed low and tugged him again. He complied, and they scurried together toward the large concrete plinth of a statue, skidding around it to safety. "You're hit?" Charlton said. She wiped at the blood pouring from her face, noticed the hole in the sleeve of her jacket. "Shit," she said. She hadn't even realized. But as the adrenaline started to wear off, the pain arrived. She grimaced and squeezed her eyes shut. "We're gonna be okay," she said, trying to reassure them both. A shout came from across the road. "Police?" Kedja glanced around the concrete to see one of the attackers in cover behind a truck. But where was his companion, the 4th shooter? 2 police officers burst onto the scene, surrounding the gunman. They gave a quick-shouted warning or instruction of some kind, but a beat later they opened fire and the attacker's body pulsed from the barrage of bullets. A wave of nausea washed through Kedja, and she had to swallow hard to keep her insides in. She scuttled the other way, peeking out from the other side of the statue. That man, the one who'd tackled their attackers, he was there, weapon in his hands still. The next moment, the final attacker darted into view from the other side of the Mercedes. Bullets sprayed and cut into him, and he went down in a heap of his own blood. The gunfire stopped. Sirens came from all directions, shouting from more police closing in, too. The Good Samaritan turned in Kedja's direction. He locked eyes with her for a split second. She froze. Then he dropped his weapon, turned, and sprinted away. Chapter 2. Marietta, Georgia. Curtis shut down the engine of his Range Rover, but remained in the plush cream leather seat. A more than comfortable enough place to sit and spend some time, but it wasn't his fondness of the car that caused him to pause. His eyes moved across the windows of his home, the red brick-fronted house as handsome as ever, and his pride at the building belonging to him as strong as ever, too. He and Rachel had bought the place only 6 months ago. A cut-price deal, considering the location and its size, reflecting the amount of work it needed. They'd already spent a small fortune as they began the process of turning it into their dream home. Sash windows renovated, roof and cladding replaced, internal walls and ceilings stripped and made good, and they'd restored tiles and hardwood floors to their original glory. Curtis loved his home. So, why was he finding it so hard to go inside? He glanced at the clock on the dash before he put his hand to the door and stepped out into the cold evening, just gone 8 p.m. The night was chilly, even though spring had apparently arrived. He headed over to the front door, opened it, and went inside. "Rachel?" "In here." Kitchen. He took off his jacket and shoes and walked across the patterned tiles to the back of the house and the sprawling kitchen, the only room they hadn't yet remodeled downstairs. The worn wooden cabinets, the drab brown walls, the dated appliances, everything looked and smelled of oldness in here, even if it remained usable enough and had undoubtedly cost a fortune when installed a couple of decades ago. For some reason, Curtis felt daunted about the prospect of turning this space around now. Nothing like the excitement that had filled both him and Rachel not long back. His wife was sitting at the kitchen counter, facing away from him with her head tilted to look up at the small TV on the wall. He approached her and kissed her on the cheek. She had the remains of a plate of food in front of her and a full glass of white wine. The now empty bottle it had come from stood across the counter. "I started without you," she said, not looking at him. "I can see. I tried calling. He didn't bother to finish the sentence. "In the middle of something," he almost said, but what did those bland words help to explain exactly? Anyway, missed calls between them were par for the course these days, both of them continuously under the cosh, sleepwalking to middle age, one 70-hour work week at a time. "It's in the fridge," she said. "Just a microwave meal." He opened the fridge door. The huge space was practically empty, except for butter, beer, wine, his favorite collection of hot sauces, and a chicken parmigiana. Last night he'd suggested they go to a restaurant this evening or get takeout, or that he could even make something, but quite honestly, after the day he'd had and how late he'd arrived home, this was his preferred option now anyway. "Thanks," he said. He plonked the plastic container in the microwave and set it on high for 5 minutes. "How was your day?" he asked, as he snapped the cap off a beer. Not that he really was interested in the answer, but he knew Rachel liked to vent, and it was the done thing, right? Married couples telling each other about their days, the highs and lows. Curtis hated it. hated having to go through it all in his mind a second time. Rachel swiveled around on the stool, glass in hand, a couple of fingers of her wine already gone. Her face was still made up from a day in the office, but she looked seriously tired. Her eyes glazed, a little bloodshot, probably exactly how he looked. "Bellamy has been on my back all day," she said. "I just don't get it." "He still doesn't think you should go to trial?" "Doesn't think it? It's more than that. It's like his life is threatened by the prospect. I don't know what his game is anymore. Maybe it's all just to screw me over." "Why would he want that?" She didn't answer as she took another sip of her wine. Well, more of a glug, really. "I told you before," Curtis said, "stick to your guns. If you think the deal is bullshit, then don't accept it." "That's easy for you to say, isn't it?" The words snapped out of her mouth like shotgun pellets, her bitterness evident. But that was simply the way she saw their work. She was the overworked defense attorney, living the dream by being the type of lawyer everyone saw depicted in movies, but earning nowhere near what her talent and hard work deserved, not to mention the stress. Meanwhile, he had sold out to work as a corporate lawyer serving rich clients. As irritated as that view made him, Curtis still bit back a response. And after all, it was their respective careers which had brought them together in the first place. He'd first met her when one of his clients had been on trial for fraud. They'd worked together for months, preparing, getting closer all the time, had slept together for the first time 3 nights before his client was cleared. Their lives had seemed so similar then, not just their careers, but a sense of shared pain that brought them closer. Him meeting her only a few years after his mom's death, when he was still finding comfort for his grief by dedicating his heart and soul to his work. Head in the sand, perhaps. Rachel, on the other hand, was an only child and didn't have the added complication of an estranged sibling like him, but her dad had died when she was in her teens. She'd hated him, hated how he'd abused both her and her mom, but she'd also become distant from her mom in the aftermath. Perhaps guilt of some sort, or perhaps because she'd felt her mom should have done more to protect her. Her mom lived near Seattle now, thousands of miles away, and had remarried. Rachel hardly ever spoke to her, saw her even less. When Curtis and Rachel had met, they'd both had so little emotional support around them, which he knew explained why they'd both tied their lives so closely to their work back then. Except now, years later, that same work ethic no longer brought them closer together. It only pushed them further and further apart. He downed half of his beer in 2 large gulps. The alcohol provided immediate relief to his weary mind. He put the bottle down and went over to his wife again. She barely moved as he put his arms around her and brought her close. "Why don't we do something this weekend?" he said. "We could both do with a break, a night away to get our minds off work." She didn't answer. A few moments later, she pulled back from the embrace. "I told Bellamy I'd go in Saturday morning," she said, "just for half a day." "Meal out Friday night, then?" "Everywhere good'll be booked." She finished the remainder of her wine. "I can try," Curtis said. "We haven't been to Valentino's for months." She stood up from the stool. "Maybe, but I was trying to get a dinner date with Ann and Russ, remember?" No, he didn't remember, and the idea didn't appeal at all, even if Russ was technically his friend. She headed over to the fridge. Curtis glanced at the TV. The news. Something a bit more light-hearted would have been better after the toil of a working day. The scrolling banner on the screen and the report itself both carried the same story about an armed attack near the Capitol building in which several people had been injured and at least 3 attackers were dead. "You want some?" Rachel said. Curtis glanced over his shoulder. She held a bottle of Cremant in her hand. What are we celebrating? The humph she gave showed she really didn't appreciate the jovial comment. Yes, please, he added quickly. It's almost a good news story for once, she said, nodding toward the TV. Curtis flinched when the cork popped out of the bottle. Good news, he said, his eyes now firmly fixed on the screen. He'd heard about the incident several times throughout the afternoon. News alert on his watch, the top story on his phone's news feed, but he hadn't paid it any real attention until now. How sad was that? That a major incident in which multiple people had lost their lives was seemingly so commonplace that it drew little more than a cursory reaction from him. Some guy stopped the attack, Rachel said. A random passerby. Yeah? Curtis said, only half listening to her. Over the top of the newscaster's voice, shaky cell phone footage played of the apparent moment the passerby first intervened. Elliot Charlton, Curtis said. The senator? The intended target, apparently. She handed him a flute of sparkling wine and chinked his glass. So, just who is the mystery hero? The newscaster said, as the screen paused on an out-of-focus image of the man. That is the question on a nation's lips tonight. Blue jacket, jeans, tall, lean, cap covering his face, most of his face anyway. Curtis stared as the world around him blurred and a year-old memory stirred. The last time he'd seen his brother. The sun's rays blasted through the wide windows, making the room feel uncomfortably stuffy and airless. Curtis stared down at the photograph on the dresser. The only photograph, the only knick-knack of any kind, left on display in the bedroom now. He deliberately left this one until last. The dresser itself, 5 drawers high, old, dark-stained pine wood that was scratched and worn and marked, but in a way which somehow gave it a hearty charm, was something of a family hand-me-down, having come from Curtis's great-aunt to his grandmother, then finally to his mother over 15 years ago. 3 families, even more house moves. In many ways, he wasn't sure if he wanted to see the piece of furniture ever again, though he'd already decided he'd take it with him today, if it fitted in the back of his car. Just one more thing he was unable to let go of. He picked up the photo frame, holding it gently like it was an injured baby bird whose newly formed wings were as delicate as sugar paper. 4 smiles beamed back at him. Himself, 9 years old, Finn, 7, and his mom and dad in their early 40s. He remembered the day, their first vacation after moving from England to Georgia. The bright sunshine, the smell of the pine trees that surrounded the lakeside cabin, the glistening blue pool with a seahorse mural at the bottom that he and Finn had challenged each other to dive down to and touch. The endless fun they'd had jumping in and out of the water for hours on end, until their fingers were like prunes and their ears sloshed with trapped pool water. Yet, as familiar as the still image had become, as vivid as the whole day burned in his mind, looking at the picture now, he barely recognized his parents. They looked so young and full of life. Why couldn't he grasp that image of them, that version of them, in his head? He heard the faint clunk of a car door outside. He moved to the window and peered down below. Finn stood by the front gate, arms folded, looking up. He spotted Curtis and motioned to him. Curtis sighed and, picture still in his hand, headed down the stairs and out to his brother. The warm sunshine, the blue sky, such a contrast to the mood of the day. Curtis would much rather it was cold, wet, and dreary. "You're leaving already?" Curtis said, as he looked from his brother to the car where Finn's girlfriend, Emily, was already seated in the passenger seat, phone in hand. "We've got a long journey." "I thought you wanted to help me." "I thought I had." "The movers haven't even arrived yet." Curtis glanced at his watch. They were half an hour late. Typical. Finn sighed. "What else can we do? We've got everything that means anything. The rest is junk. The rest will be put to good use for people who need it." "You want this?" Curtis said. He held the photo out. Finn set his eyes on it, and for a few moments said nothing. Then he took it from Curtis and smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." "So, where are you off to this time?" Curtis asked. "Dubai." Curtis said nothing, but the scathing look he received from Finn suggested his brother had read his thoughts. "It might not be your lifestyle of choice," Finn said, "but that doesn't mean it's bad." Curtis glanced over to Emily, still focused on her phone. He'd only met her for the first time at the funeral 2 days ago. She seemed nice enough, even if he knew next to nothing about her other than that Finn had met her a few months previously. As smitten as she seemed, Curtis had doubts as to how much longer she had left on Finn's merry-go-round of life. Finn reached out and put his hand on Curtis's shoulder. "I know it's been harder for you. You've been stuck so close to—" "Stuck?" Curtis glared at his brother, and the conciliatory look on Finn's face dropped away. "Seriously, what do you mean by stuck?" Curtis said. "Do you mean for the past 6 months I've been our mom's daily carer? The one of us by her side as she wasted away? Is that what you mean?" "No," Finn responded, his tone just as hard as Curtis's, as though he was the aggrieved party. "But I'm not going to stand here and make a problem when there isn't one. It's hardly appropriate." "Appropriate? What about— I only mean— isn't it now time to think about yourself? I loved Mom just as much as you did. I loved them both, but I can see the burden on you." "A burden? They were our parents. You know what I mean." "Do I? So you know the burden's been on me, yet you still stayed away." Finn shoved the picture back into Curtis's chest. "You know what? Screw this." Curtis took the photo back as Finn turned and strode to his car. "Running away again?" Curtis shouted after him. Finn grabbed the door handle, then paused and turned back. "No," he said. "I'm just trying to live my life. Perhaps you should try it. Don't you think they would have wanted you to?" He got into the driver's seat, the engine fired up, and a moment later revved freely as the car shot down the street. As if on cue from the opposite direction, the removal truck came to a rocking halt. The driver wound down his window. "Sorry, mister. Lousy traffic." Curtis didn't say anything. He was still too busy replaying his brother's words in his mind. "Mister?" "Yeah, fine," Curtis said. "Whatever. Follow me." Picture in hand, he turned and headed back inside. Ping, ping, ping. Curtis snapped from his thoughts with a jolt. His eyes remained fixed on the TV. The news report had finished, the screen now taken over by a weather map showing the sunny forecast for the next day. He looked over to the microwave, then caught Rachel's eye. Her wineglass was already empty. She stared at him, curiously. "Are you okay?" she said. "You look like you've seen it." "That smells damn good," he said, getting up from the stool. "Look like I've seen a what?" he thought, as he moved over to the microwave. "A ghost? Well, she wasn't far wrong." Chapter 3. Despite the scene around him, Curtis only recognized that he was asleep when he heard Rachel's voice. She wasn't in the dream. Mom, Dad, and Finn were. The family back together again. Finn and Curtis as teenagers, a time long, long before he'd met his wife. Hearing her voice calling his name gave him a shot of reality, and the pressure on his upper arm finally roused him. Groggy, head hurting, as the dream faded, he took a few moments to work over the night before in his head, and the reason for his less than sprightly state before finally opening his eyes to look up at his wife. She leant over him, already dressed for work in a deep blue suit, hair neat, makeup on. "You didn't come to bed last night," she said. He groaned. "What time is it?" "Nearly 8. She glanced at her watch, more like glared at it, as though blaming it for the passage of time. She usually left closer to 7 to avoid the notorious Atlanta traffic. Was she blaming her lateness on him? Curtis winced as he pushed himself up on the sofa, averting his eyes from the tumbler and near-empty bottle of bourbon on the coffee table next to his laptop. Laptop? The lid was up, the screen dark, but had he closed all the windows before going to sleep? Had Rachel seen? "What's going on, Curtis?" Rachel said, looking more worried than angry as her forehead creased over in a frown. "Nothing." "How much of that did you drink?" She nodded to the bottle. "It was already opened." She didn't question that further. After all, she was the one chugging wine last night before heading up to bed on wobbly legs, before it had even got to 10 o'clock. "You'd tell me," she said, "if there was something wrong. With us?" Curtis tutted and threw his hand onto the sofa arm, causing her to flinch. "You always have to turn things onto you," he said, sounding angrier than he'd intended, but he didn't say anything to try and take the comment back or to explain. He held her eye for a moment, not sure whether she was upset or about to rage at him. She broke eye contact first, then turned and stomped out of the room, her heels clacking on the wood floor. Each step sent a judder through Curtis's throbbing head, and he imagined each strike leaving a neat imprint in the expensively finished wood. She knew he hated her wearing her heels in there. Had she done that deliberately? He pushed the bubbling anger aside as best he could and leaned forward. The smell of stale whiskey wafted up from the empty glass and stuck in his nostrils, making his stomach churn. He tried his hardest to ignore the queasiness as he woke the laptop. Desktop. That was good, so Rachel hadn't seen. Which meant he had no explaining to do, no unraveling of a years-old lie. Yet. He picked up his phone from beside the computer and saw several unread work emails to deal with since he'd gone to sleep last night. A problem of the always switched-on modern business world. If important, he'd normally deal with calls, messages, emails as and when they came in, whatever the day or hour, if he was awake. This time, his mind remained too busy churning the information he'd delved into the night before, coming back to him beat by beat as his brain fully came round from sleep. He put his phone back on the table and went for a shower, got dressed, ate some cereal, drank a cup of tea. His stomach couldn't face coffee, even if his head could do with the caffeine. He drove to the office in nearby Sandy Springs, a northern suburb of Atlanta that was now a city in its own right, even if it remained intrinsically linked to its nearby bigger brother. He paused outside the revolving doors to the building, a reluctance taking over him. He'd never had this before, never felt so conflicted going inside, getting on with his day and his never-ending work. He'd devoted nearly 20 grueling years of his life to this career, more than 6 of which to this company who'd shown faith in him by making him a partner 4 years ago. But today... "Hey, Curtis," came a relaxed female voice from behind him. He turned to see Heidi, another of the partners, though she was a few years more senior than him and specialized in marital law, which meant their paths rarely crossed in a professional sense. She carried a cardboard tray with 4 huge takeaway cups. "Treat for the team," she said, holding the tray up. "Lucky them." She paused for a moment, and the happy, charming look on her face wavered. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah, fine," he said. He held the door open for her before heading to the elevators, emerging shortly after on the 6th floor. He made a beeline for his desk in the far corner. He nodded and smiled at the few faces that popped up from the gray dividers in the open-plan space. He received a couple of curious glances in return, but didn't bother to question why. Curtis settled himself down at his desk and reached in his bag for his laptop, but hadn't even set it down before Gerard was up on his feet and striding his way. "Where have you been?" the underling said, as though he were in charge. "Excuse me?" "Harrison's have been waiting for more than 20 minutes. I've done my best to—" "Shit!" "Sorry, Gerard." How had he forgotten about the meeting with his client? "I did try calling you." "Are they still waiting?" Gerard checked his watch. "Yeah, but only for another 5 minutes. Wayne said he has to leave the office after that, so we'll have to rearrange." Wayne, being the CEO of Harrison's, one of his company's most important clients. As Gerard moved away, Curtis grabbed the desk phone, dialed, and Wayne picked up on the first ring. Curtis did his best to smooth things over, apologizing profusely, blaming his lateness on a traffic delay, promising he and his team would be finished with the report by the end of the week, and insisting that he'd make it up to him by taking him to that new steakhouse in Midtown that everyone had been talking about. The last part seemed to do the trick more than anything else. "I'll get Sarah to rearrange the conference call ASAP and to make the dinner reservation," Curtis said. "Yeah, okay. I gotta go," Wayne replied, before the line went dead. Gerard, sixth sense as ever, poked his head up before rising to his feet and scuttling over. "Sorted?" "I think so." "You okay?" he asked, with what Curtis thought was genuine concern. How many more people were going to ask him that question today? "I'm fine." He left it at that, and before long Gerard had skulked back off. Curtis tried. He really did, but only half an hour later his brain burst with thoughts and questions and worries. The Harrisons' report would have to wait. He opened up Google and typed the short query. He didn't have to try hard to find several recent stories about the previous day's attack in Washington. Reward offered for unidentified hero. He clicked on that headline first, saw the now familiar still shot from outside the Capitol building, the blurred image of the man everyone was calling a hero. Unidentified, except Curtis knew who he was. Did no one else? But if Curtis was so sure of the hero's identity, why had he told no one? He read the story, an offer of $50,000 for the hero to come forward, cash from Elliot Charlton himself, the self-made multi-millionaire businessman turned politician. Well, self-made if you ignored the obvious lifelong societal connections gained from private schooling, followed by being a shoo-in at Harvard, and a substantial leg up from rich parents to start his own financial consulting business. Curtis clicked on the link to an interview with the politician, posted only minutes before. "I'm profoundly grateful to this man," Charlton rattled in his clipped accent, his voice direct and authoritative. "Who knows how many innocent people would have been hurt were it not for this hero. I'm absolutely sure I wouldn't be standing here today without his help." "You've offered to make a cash reward to the hero," a female reporter said. "Can you tell us why?" "It's a simple gesture of gratitude," Charlton replied. "I'm hoping the offer will encourage this reluctant savior to come forward, so he can be properly thanked and given the attention he deserves." "Do you have any more information to provide on the identities of the attackers?" "No, I do not. You'll have to wait on that information from the police. I'm not party to their investigation other than as a witness." "Don't you wonder why this person, this man of the hour hasn't yet come forward? Do you think they might be in hiding, scared that they might be a target of whoever organized this attack?
It's possible. I can only reiterate and reassure this person that, like myself, they are a witness to this terrible crime. I'm sure they will be given full protection by the authorities.
Bizarre, isn't it? Curtis jolted in his seat and looked over to see his assistant Sarah hovering, pen and paper pad in hand. He hadn't seen her approach. Hadn't seen her come in at all. Her desk had been empty when he'd arrived. She was probably off chatting somewhere like she often did. He quickly closed the browser window. Scary, Curtis said. Just think if that guy hadn't been there to save the day. Yeah. A lot of people are saying he must be military, even special forces or something, the way he reacted. Finn? Special forces? Curtis didn't know exactly what his brother had been up to these last few years, but it definitely wasn't that. You know, I heard 2 of the attackers are still alive, Sarah said. The police have been really secretive, but you know how these things get out.
Did he?
I heard one of them's in critical condition. The police must know by now who they are, though. Don't you think it's odd they're not saying anything about that?
I really wouldn't know the protocol for this sort of thing.
Sarah frowned as though his comment was unexpected.
What can I help you with? He asked.
She paused a moment. Gerard said you needed another meeting set up with Wayne. A dinner, too? Curtis explained the situation and asked Sarah to arrange the meeting as late into the week as she could. Then dinner sometime after that. He waited until she'd returned to her desk and had her phone pressed to her ear, its usual resting place, before he looked back at his laptop. This wasn't the time or the place to continue his research, and really he had no time anyway. He opened up his calendar, back-to-back meetings starting in half an hour all the way through to 1:30. Then again, 3 until 6, most likely a few hours needed after that to get everything in order. A usual day for him, really. His head hurt all the more just thinking about it. How had his life come to this point? More than that, why was he only questioning it now? He simply couldn't face another day like this, not today. And yet, he would have. He would have ground out day after day like this. He already had, for years, in fact. Even he couldn't explain it. Or maybe didn't want to think about it. But seeing Finn had changed everything. Or perhaps just woken him up, finally. He put his laptop into his bag and stood up and grabbed his coat. Gerard looked up, an eyebrow raised. Sarah pulled the phone from her ear and cupped the receiver as she glanced at him, looking aggrieved.
I'm really not feeling good, he said to her. I'll be on the phone, but I need to go home.
Oh, but...
Can you do your best to rearrange everything, please?
But...
He carried on without giving her the chance for a proper response. He did feel bad about putting her in the shit like that. Gerard and the rest of the team too, but not bad enough to change his mind. And he hadn't lied as such. He did feel like crap, even if it was self-inflicted. But he had lied about going home because he had absolutely no intention of doing that. Instead, he had a drive ahead of him, the start of the hunt for the man the whole nation had on their minds. The hero. Curtis, his long-lost, selfish prick of a little brother. Chapter 4. Clemson, South Carolina. Curtis pulled the car over to the side of the road and looked out at the row of modest, detached homes, each carrying an orange tinge from the streetlights now that darkness had descended. The drive here was only a couple of hours, but he'd needed hours longer to find this address. He checked his phone before he got out of the car. He didn't know what he felt more after his day of secretive amateur sleuthing, pride or shame.
He'd received a multitude of pings through the day, mostly emails from work colleagues and clients, and he'd yet to reply to a single one. He amazed himself at how quickly he'd shut himself off from that world. How liberating it felt, in fact. What did that say about the work-obsessed man he'd become? He last received a prompt from the office some 3 hours ago, so apparently people there were starting to get the point. The most recent pings were all from Rachel. Do you want dinner or not? It was the latest in a short series of messages from her, a more agitated edge to each one, he could tell. Go ahead without me, I'll be home late. X. He hoped the kiss would go some way to appeasing her. While he felt no remorse for leaving his co-workers in the lurch, he did feel bad for not telling Rachel what he was doing, even if he didn't feel bad for not being at home with her. It wasn't as though they had wonderful, relaxed evenings together much these days. He pushed the thought aside when he spotted movement outside the car window. A couple were walking by, arm in arm. They casually strode up the driveway to a house 2 along from where Curtis had parked. He didn't recognize either of their faces in the dark, but that was the house he had in his sights. The owners? Greg and Amy Thatcher. Curtis had never met Amy before, but he had met Greg a long time ago, when both Greg and Finn were students at Clemson University, and back before Finn's and Curtis's lives had fully drifted. Finn had enjoyed a globe-trotting existence since then. Greg Thatcher, apparently less so. Did that mean that Curtis was wasting his time here if the two men's lives had likely diverged many years ago? Possibly, but Curtis had decided to start here nonetheless. If anything, he'd taken the more than 100-mile journey into South Carolina on something of a whim. The last postal address he had for his brother, from some 10 years ago, was in Charlotte, another drive further north and east from here. So he'd felt stopping in the city where Finn had spent several years studying was worthwhile, and would hopefully save him some time. He had no clue of any friends or associates of Finn's from Charlotte, but he did recall some of them from Clemson, and it wasn't a stretch that one or more of them remained in touch with Finn, or at least had been in touch with him more recently than Curtis had. Not that it had been easy to find Greg Thatcher. Curtis hadn't even known the guy's surname until a couple of hours ago, but Curtis had scoured Google Street View and eventually recognized the shared house where Finn had spent his last year in Clemson as a post-grad. He'd also found that the house remained rented out by the same landlord as all those years ago, and Curtis had tracked him down earlier after first arriving in the small city. Now in his 70s, Abdul Ahmed had been more than reluctant to provide any details of his previous tenants, and in fact had claimed to not even have kept the records. He'd been lying, and some gentle pressure by Curtis, who brought out his best legal speak, threatening to expose the dodgy state of some of Ahmed's student properties if he didn't help, had done the trick, and Ahmed had handily found the old tenant records shortly after that. 4 names, including Finn Delaney. Greg Thatcher was the only one of the 4 who still lived in Clemson, so he was the one Curtis had decided to go to first. He stepped out of the car and looked around before he approached the front door. He rang the bell and waited. A few seconds later, he heard footsteps before the door opened a few inches, and the face of a woman he didn't know at all poked out. "I'm looking for Greg Thatcher," Curtis said, suddenly feeling lame. The woman, who he recognized as Amy Thatcher from her husband's Facebook posts, frowned and opened her mouth, but before she said anything, Greg appeared behind her. Late 30s, but he looked a little older, with silvery, messy hair and weary eyes. "Can I help you?" he said, his voice gruff and a little unwelcoming as he came up behind his wife. "Greg, you remember me, Curtis Delaney, Finn's brother?" Curtis held out his hand. The woman stepped aside as Greg came to the front.
He paused for a moment before somewhat reluctantly giving Curtis's hand a limp shake. "Honey, go back in. It's cold out." The woman gave Greg a suspicious look, but then disappeared inside. "Yeah, I think I remember you," Greg said, squinting as though to aid his recollection. "It's been a long time." "It has. And you're here because—" "I'm looking for Finn." Greg frowned. "Your brother. You came to me to look for your own brother? Why would I know? You two were close. 15 years ago, yeah. I've not heard from Finn for a long time. To be honest, I'm quite happy about that." Greg glared at Curtis as though he was supposed to know what that meant. "Something happened between you two?" "Yeah. Look, sorry, Curtis, but you can see how odd this is, right? You knocking on my door at night, asking about your brother who— So you haven't been in touch with him at all?" Curtis interrupted, looking over Greg's shoulder as though expecting to see Finn inside somewhere, hiding. Was that possible? Would Finn have come here? Why would he be hiding at all? "No," Greg said. "I haven't. I'm sorry." Curtis reached inside his jacket and pulled out a business card and handed it to Greg, who scrutinized it for a second. "If you do see or hear from him, it's very important." "Sandy Springs? You came all the way from Georgia to ask about Finn?" "Sorry for the intrusion," Curtis said. He turned and made to walk away. "Is he in trouble?" Greg asked, and something about his tone caused Curtis to pause and turn back. "It's hard to explain," Greg said, "but I always felt that one day, I don't know, your brother had a way of irritating people, sometimes the wrong people." Curtis smiled a little, though he didn't really know why. "Yeah," he said, "he certainly did. Trouble? I honestly don't know, but I really do need to find him." Greg waved the business card in some sort of mock salute, as though a gesture of his commitment to informing Curtis if he came across anything of use. "Good night," Curtis said, before moving back toward his car. He had his hand on the door when he jerked back, spinning around, certain someone was coming up behind him. But there was no one there. He scanned the street, spotted movement, but not close by, probably 20, 30 yards in front of him. He was sure he'd spotted a figure scuttling between the parked cars, but they hadn't emerged in the road the other side. He took a few steps that way, eyes never leaving the spot, but he saw nothing in the darkness now. He kept going, his heart rate steadily building. What the hell was he doing? And what would happen if there was someone hiding? Confront them? He'd never had his brother's knack or confidence for fighting. "Finn?" Curtis said, little more than a whisper, immediately feeling foolish for doing so. Did he really expect his brother to be cowering between cars? Curtis shook his head to try and find some clarity. He turned around and looked back at the Thatcher's home, where his eyes rested on the downstairs front window, where a shadowy figure stood behind the glass in a near-dark room. Greg or his wife, Curtis really couldn't tell, and he averted his eyes and set off at pace for his car. When he took one more glance at the house, there was no one there. Weird. In the dark, he didn't see the uneven slab. His big toe kicked it, and he stumbled forward. He tried to keep upright, but he failed on the third step and rolled into an ungainly fall, bouncing across the soggy, grassy verge. He pulled himself to his feet, not even bothering to check himself over or brush himself down before he jogged to his car. Moments later, he pulled away into the road. He glanced in the rearview mirror to where the Thatcher's home faded in the distance. No sign of anyone or anything lurking. He shook his head, disappointed with himself, then cringed as the stench took over. He felt down to his wet trousers and squirmed when his fingers found the sticky mess. He lifted his hand back up. He didn't need any light to see what it was. Shit, he said, with no hint of irony. The journey home was long and uncomfortable. He stopped at a gas station to at least attempt to clean off some of the excrement, but his clothes remained damp and smelly for the duration. He pulled onto the drive a little before 10 p.m. Lights were still on downstairs. Rachel was up, although he hadn't heard from her in over 2 hours, as though she'd given up on any hope of an evening together long ago. He opened the door to the house quietly, on the off chance that she had gone to bed already and simply left the lights on downstairs. But he heard soft voices from the TV as he closed the door behind him. He took off his shoes and walked slowly across the hall to the lounge doorway. Rachel, lying down on the sofa, propped herself up when she realized he was standing there. She looked tired at first, but became more alert when she took in the state of him. What happened? Don't ask. I think I just did. She didn't sound happy. I fell over, in the dark, right in some dog shit. She pulled a disgusted face. She had no idea. He'd had to sit through the smell for over 2 hours. Drinking again? He said, indicating the wine glass and bottle of white, both empty. You're judging me? He didn't respond to that. I'm going for a shower. A heavenly shower. Though as refreshed as his body felt after, cleaned and wrapped up in his thick robe, his mind remained busy and unfulfilled. He headed back downstairs, where he once again found Rachel on the sofa, though she'd turned the TV off and was sitting upright, poised. So, she said. What? Are you going to tell me where you've been all night and why you came home looking like a bum? Just work. You know what it's been like. She stood up from the sofa. I know something's going on, she said, holding his eye. What I can't work out is if the lies are because it's something you're protecting me from or something you're protecting yourself from. He thought about that for a moment, though couldn't figure the answer out. It's just been a really long day, he said, hanging his head. The most common excuse of all for both of them. He felt so useless. In many ways he wanted to tell her. With the strain between them growing for all sorts of reasons, he hated the idea of keeping secrets from his wife, knew it'd only make things worse. But where would he even start in telling her about Finn after all these years? She came up to him, and he relaxed a little, thinking she was about to hug him. He really wanted that. After a full day of turmoil in his mind, he really needed that feeling of closeness and wanted her to feel it too. They didn't share little interactions like that anywhere near as much as they should do, as much as they used to. But she didn't hug him. Instead, she stood there and looked at him, disappointedly. If you do anything to hurt me, he didn't say anything to the unfinished threat. I don't know what's going on, Curtis, but you know what? What? Until you're ready to let me in, best get used to that sofa. She swaggered past. How much had she drunk? He shuddered when she slammed the bedroom door shut, then let out a